Welcome back after lunch, and welcome to the low carbon economy session, which will have the pleasure of joining and participating in over the next 100 minutes. So we have three speakers all on various aspects of low carbon economy. Our first speaker is Yukari Yamashita. Our second speaker will be Geoff. Geoff Lewis, and then Christophe Bonnery. That's the order we agreed on, isn't it? Yeah, excellent, okay. And we agreed we'll have about 25 minutes for each of the speakers, and then a combined Q&A discussion session at the end. So please welcome Yukari Yamashita. She's the IAEE President for 2020, board member for the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, as well as the director in charge of the Energy Data and Modeling Center in Japan. Welcome. Your slides.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yukari Yamashita, and I greeted you this morning. Today I would like to talk about the reality check for the low-carbon economy. In the opening plenary, somebody asked a question about how about Asia? So probably my viewpoint is from looking from Asia, that small island called Japan, but we are considering about the neighboring Asian countries as well. Oops. Oh, this doesn't work this way?
Maybe try a few things.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's not the screen mode yet.
I'll try on the keyboard. Maybe this will work.
Yes,
maybe
thank
if
you.
you use the arrows.
Okay, hidden tool. I just list up the new players in town. We have been thinking in terms of traditional fossil fuel-based economies, but now because of this principle of responsible investment, or TCFD, or ESG, which were all mentioned this morning from the investment community, or financial sector, the coal divestment has been happening, and then the decarbonization trend has been very much emphasized. So, and also another trend is like a rapid shift towards the electric vehicles, or aggressive plan to introduce renewables. Some governments are talking about 100% renewables in a very short period of time. And of course, the rapid shift towards natural gas, if you were to keep using the fossil fuels. Does that mean that there are no more fossil fuels tomorrow, or not even nuclear, because it's becoming costly? And then that actually is coinciding or in parallel happening with the climate crisis, so-called. The resilience or adaptation or sustainabilities are all buzzwords which we hear about, but it's not only buzzword. It's happening. Very extreme case of the natural disasters are happening here and there or everywhere. But on the other hand, there is a bright side of these new players, the growing expectations towards digitalization. But of course, there is a small concern as well on the side. The growing expectations is that we talk about big data, IT, ICT, robotics will play some role in matching supply and demand with a lower cost, and then in a short period of time, like by second or smaller than second, to make our optimization possible with the least possible supply capacity. We can meet the demand which will be out there, especially in electricity. But on the other side, we do have some concern about intellectual property rights or trade conflicts or cyber attack. I am no specialist about all these IT technologies, so don't ask me about the details, but I do hear things. On another bright side, I would like to emphasize that there is a carbon-free hydrogen in town. We talk about it a lot, and then some of you already know that they have color, gray, blue, green. You hear about it. Carbon-free has to be blue or green. I will discuss that a little bit at the very end. And of course, CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, or sequestration. Okay, I have to use this. But of course, we should not forget about these goals. The all goals, the Sustainable Development Goals are important. We emphasize too much on the climate issues at the moment, but we have to actually consider all the other goals. And then no poverty, energy access, or the cleaner water, the potable water, or enough food. So we have to take all that into consideration and to have the future of the global community. That is what we are facing, but we tend to emphasize on climate change nowadays because of this pressure coming from EU or the financial sector. I'm not blaming them, but it's happening, and it's happening rather rapidly, that we have to actually collaborate and think about how to deal with it. But we have to also note all these some culprits or some challenges which are not necessarily talked about. There are many scenarios, as it has been also emphasized in the plenary, open plenary. There are many scenarios, but we are ultimately aiming at net zero emission of the CO2. So how do we do that? We all know, we are all aware that energy conservation or energy saving or energy efficiency is important. That is actually the second one from the last, energy intensity. But at the same time, if we talk about zero emission, we have to make this part zero. Then why don't we talk about these two? Because we are hoping that we will become more affluent, we will have more population on this Earth planet. And then currently we have the 7.5 or 7.7 billion people on the ground, and of which about maybe a little less than 1 billion people are without access to energy. And we are additionally expecting 2 billion people by 2050, meaning just adding 1 and 2, 3 billion people are waiting into the future to be supplied with the energy or to have the access to the energy. So that itself is an amazing number. And then we are at the same time talking about not using the fossil fuels. Oops, sorry, no, this one. Oops. No, it doesn't work either. Okay. And in the picture, I recap of reducing energy consumption and then try to meet the climate change goal comes like that. If we were a little bit more realistic and then just add up the technologies which we can envision. This is our IEEJ's outlook, and then we see that, okay, our primary energy consumption will start to decline, and then coal, the red line, how can I do that? Red line, or the oil, the blue line, or even the natural gas will start to saturate and then they go down. On the other hand, the wind power and solar power or geothermal or hydro will go up, and then the nuclear, even in some part of the world, they will see increase in the nuclear. For example, the wind, we see the 6 times bigger, photovoltaics 10 times bigger, and yet it won't make the goal. It won't meet the goal. This is the another way of looking at the energy-related CO2 emission of our case. The blue line is a reference scenario, as I said, in the primary energy consumption, and then the advanced technology scenario, which is the bottom-up technology, which we envision its possible maximum introduction of the climate change tackling technologies as well as policies won't meet 50% reduction by 2050 in our estimation. If we stretch a little bit and try to meet the 2-degree target by 2150. That is a green line here, but it will be still short of it by 2050 because we are looking at a longer future to meet the target. So what is happening? Actually, for the red case, we see that the 70% or more of the energy source will be the fossil fuels. So we will be still looking at dependent on the fossil fuels world. In Asia, we have other challenges like air pollution. We need a cleaner air. Those people who are from this part of these pictures, you remember how it is. The traffic jam, air pollution, congestion, and etc. And then health issue. Another thing which I want to point out, we all know that Asia is a growth center, economic growth center, and that means in order to grow the economy, we need to have the energy consumption. And then energy consumption, we used to be very happy using the domestic or regionally available energy. So we used to be self-sufficient as Asia as a whole. But now we are slowly started to see they are all becoming dependent on imported energy sources. The very drastic change would be for the ASEAN as a whole. They used to be very happy trading among themselves to supply their energy needs, but they will very rapidly become dependent on the import. And of course China or India has been already, and Japan as well. If you note that Japan is actually increasing self-sufficiency, that is because we assume that nuclear will come back, and then also we are we are using more and more renewables in our energy scene. So, but we do have different sources of energy to burn, etc. No, I can't remember. I'm a very bad student of this. Another thing is that because we are so dependent on the import, especially of oil from abroad, we will be the sole buyer, I can say, from the Middle East. So the turmoil in the Middle East region is a big concern for future to be, for decades to come. If you look at the numbers which we see for China, South Asia, ASEAN, or Japan, Korea, Taiwan together, it's very high dependence on the Middle East. Worldwide, except Middle East, the average is 30% for 2050, but for us, for Asia, 50 to 80% of dependence on the Middle East. And of course, this is a rather old chart. We saw things happening even after that, like a missile hits the Saudi Aramco's oil field, or the refinery facility, or all these things happening. But it's not part of it. But we have been experiencing so many things happening there. So the turmoil in the Middle East will immediately become concern of the Asian importing countries. On the other hand, the suppliers cannot be so happy either. Because of the bad economy in the Asia, maybe they will hit very quickly from the lower volume of export from the oil. If the export or demand is lower, the price will be pushed down. So the lower price, lower sales will hit the economy. So this is the picture of the net exporters and the net importers, and how would that influence if there is less demand for the oil. And then you can see the changes between the reference scenario and the lower demand case of advanced technology scenario for the income of the Middle East or Eurasia or North America or Latin America, the exporters and importers. Importers will enjoy the less import, meaning less payment towards the imported oil or gas, but the Middle East will suffer from the lower income, less income from exporting these energies. I don't know, this is not the complete answer, but we have to accelerate energy transformation. So what do we need? In general, we need the bulk introduction of clean energy, renewables or nuclear, fossil fuels with CCS or CCUS. We need a new way of thinking, maybe new energy system or new infrastructure or new business scheme or recycling, etc. Need all players to be there. We tend to talk about suppliers, but supply side technologies, but we also have to think about the demand side technologies. Need lots of data for them to happen. The digital technologies will have a role to play. So I'm going to do the reality check. I will talk about 3 topics in a hurry, and then I'll just remind you that everything matters: economic growth, clean air, the energy security, sustainability, resilience, etc. Well, that has been already emphasized, so I will concentrate on the 3 topics up there. So we did analysis last year on the impact of banning construction of new coal-fired power plants. We in Asia is expected to be dependent on the coal-fired power plants more than in other parts of the world. So for the power generation, this is a power generation, the terawatt, and then this is the reality, and then the actual figure, and then into the 2050. So existing will retire as time goes by, so new power plants will be installed. And then our assumption has been, based on the plan of the government, is that the Asia will be more and more dependent on coal-fired power plants into the future. But then if we try to replace them and ban them, and new construction to be banned, and then they try to introduce natural gas, the thermal power plants, 100% replacement, or renewable power plants, 100% replacement, what will happen to the global community? So we first look at the non-Asia part, which is actually not so dependent on the coal-fired power plants at the moment. They are utilizing more natural gas or renewable, but then if we say that into the 2050 from 2020 we assume no coal-fired power plants, well, the difference between the reference scenario and these 2 scenario replacement, whether renewable or replacement by the natural gas, do not really change in terms of the percentages of the which power source they are going to use. Well, it's because only 20% have been used at the moment. But if you look at the Asia, we are actually dependent on 60% of our power generation on the coal-fired power plants. In the reference scenario, we reduce it, but it's still about 50%, 48%. So if we assume that no coal-fired power plants to be installed beyond 2020, then it will change the picture very drastically. The natural gas substitute scenario, replacement scenario, will make the natural gas to be very much the majority, about the half of the power generation source, and then the solar power or wind power to become about the half. But it's a very drastic change. I'm talking about the change between here and there in comparison to the reference scenario. And what does that mean? I only drew the example of the 100% natural gas scenario. So we expect in this new scenario that we will be using this much of additional natural gas to be supplied. And then in terms of using it in Asia part of the world, we have to import that by LNG. And we can count the number of the projects which are planned or which have reached the final investment decision up to 2030. And then this dotted line is actually the number of the program or projects which we could envision back in 2018 when we did our estimation that these may be available. Not necessarily everything was in place back then. So our estimate for the 2030, as a requirement, as a supply of LNG to burn that much to replace the no new coal-fired plants as LNG will be actually suppressing a little bit over, including planned and not uncertain the contract of LNG, meaning we may become very much dependent on LNG, but do we have engineers, do we have the companies to install all these, and then do we actually have the resources which are ready to be supplied into the future? And then I am only talking about 2030, 2040 or 2050 with this rather not really high price environment for the investors to make a decision. We don't know yet if this will be possible to be supplied. So this is a very quick presentation of actually normally the half an hour for one case, but we have to actually divest or walk out of the using too much coal if we can afford it. But if we are not able to afford it, what do we do? All these countries, OECD countries mainly, should help out those countries which are struggling how to deal with the coal-fired power plants phase out. We cannot actually just say that we won't loan you money, we don't know what you do, but we have to switch to cleaner energy. We have to help them out. We have to help each other. And then, of course, reduce this consumption of dirty burning of the coal exercise. Another thing is nuclear. Nuclear is struggling. Because of the safety regulation, OECD countries are one way or another struggling. US is a kind of exception. They are enjoying lower price of the natural gas that they just by switching from coal-fired power plants to natural gas, they are enjoying the cleaner air. But at the same time, even the nuclear cannot survive in certain areas, especially where the liberalized market is there. That they are also closing nuclear power plants. China and Russia are enjoying exporting their technologies. So it is becoming a little bit more biased towards the China-Russia exporting technologies, and then the other part of the world, like the Middle East or certain Asian countries, will import, and then they try to use it. But OECD countries are struggling. Dash for renewables comes with new challenges. There is already, many people already mentioned uncertainty or intermittency and low average utilization rate, and then the curtailment issues. I have only covered one topic. But the good news is that the power generation cost is going down for these renewable electricities in every part of the world. It's going to happen into the future. So this is a good smiley mark, but on the other hand, it is just the generation cost we are talking about. If we are to connect that to grid, we have to consider the integration cost, which is the pink part here. And then the more you introduce the renewables into a system, the more integration cost you have to pay. So that actually is the burden on the dependent on 100% on renewable electricity. Moreover, the resources are not evenly distributed. The yellow or orange, the warmer color means that there is a resource for solar, so in the northern Europe there is obviously not enough capacity or potential. In ASEAN they enjoy the sunshine, but on the wind side, the ASEAN doesn't really have enough or abundant the power the potential from the wind power. So we don't know exactly if it is evenly distributed, and we are talking about everybody can enjoy 100% renewables. So we have to have another the source of energy. Peak oil demand case, I hope I can talk about this before the time runs up. The OECD countries is already going down in the transport sector's oil consumption, while the non-OECD is expect to grow if nothing happens. So we assume that the zero-emission vehicles, including plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and fuel cell cars, will be the 100% of the new car sales, including buses and trucks, in our estimation, to see if the peak oil demand will happen altogether. The reference scenario is like a blue line, but then if we assume that kind of very aggressive scenario where the new car sales in 2050 will be 100% cleaner energy vehicles, then we start to see finally the peak oil demand at the around the 2030. But please remember, the level of the demand for oil, even in that case, will be as high as the current level of oil demand, meaning the old oil field have to retire over time, and then we have to still keep on upstream investment to supply this much of oil at the same level as we are now. So if we shift towards the electric vehicles very quickly, like 100% by the 2060, we are still in need of upstream development. So we cannot actually be too optimistic that the shifting towards the cleaner energy vehicle will give us the cleaner air, no oil consumption world. So it is also very much a burden for the Middle East, again, in the same way. So this is the scenario we have to go down. This is go down the negative emission into the future, but how do we do that is still in the dark. Maybe we can talk about the distributed, the digitalization, democratized, the decentralized, or the prosumers inclusive energy scene, as well as the carbon-free hydrogen I have talked about from the renewable electricity or from the carbon fossil fuels with the CCS or CCUS, and also the carbon recycle. So these are the technologies we have to look at, but we have to collaborate to make that happen. That is my very end line, the collaboration for technologies to happen, and also make the price down, and also to make the market competitive so that the industries will compete each other to make the price further down. So thank you very much for your attention. I tried to put too much into my presentation, but hope it will help you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for an important reality check. I think our next speaker is Geoff Lewis. He's Principal Analyst with the New Zealand Productivity Commission, where he's worked on and led a number of inquiries into different topics, most recently the low-carbon economy transition in New Zealand. Before the establishment of the Commission, Geoff worked as an economist at Treasury, giving policy advice and analysis there. And for those who are wondering, the Productivity Commission is an independent entity that gives advice to government aiming to, I think, enhance the well-being of New Zealanders.
That's right.
By increasing productivity growth. Isn't that right?
Yes,
okay,
exactly.
Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Frank. Kia ora tātou. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation will cover three things: a little bit of context for why I'm here, though Frank's already started to explain that. I want to tell you about the headline results that we arrived at from our inquiry in New Zealand's transition to a low emissions economy. But the main part is about the modelling we did for this inquiry, how we went about that modelling, and the insights that we obtained from that modelling. So, we do inquiries, we do some research as well, but our main business, the Productivity Commission, is undertaking inquiries for the government. As Frank said, we're an independent organisation, so we can come up with our own conclusions and recommendations free of political influence. So in 2017, and this is why I'm here, we were asked by the New Zealand government to inquire into how New Zealand can transition to a low emissions economy, while at the same time continuing to grow incomes and well-being. I'm not going to talk so much about that last part, but for the modelling, what we interpreted that as how can we transition at least cost. That's what we put into the modelling. So it was interesting because 2017 was the previous government. That was, the governing party was the National Party, which is a centre-right government. And shortly after there was an election, centre-left government, including a coalition with the Green Party. And the Minister of Climate Change is the co-leader of the Green Party. So he said, jolly good you're doing this inquiry, carry on, just one change, I want you to tighten up your target, or New Zealand's target, to net zero by 2050, where it's previously been left rather unclear, low emissions, which I think was maybe a 60% reduction from 2005 levels. So we went about the inquiry. This slide just shows you all the various steps. It's a pretty thorough process, lasts about a year. We start off publishing an issues paper, and that's followed by a draft report, maybe 6-7 months later. They each invite submissions, so we received 403 submissions for this inquiry. There's a lot of interest in it. We go out and about. Engagement is a big part of our inquiry process. Attending events, we do our own sort of investigation, look very closely at what happened in other countries, or what has been happening in other countries on this journey to low emissions. The UK Climate Change Act and other things in the UK were very influential. A lot of engagement meetings with experts in industry groups and other parts of the public sector. Things like the electricity sector, very technical and complex, so we sought some independent and expert advice on that, and the modelling. So the modelling was in 2 phases. I'm probably going to talk about the first phase, but the second phase we wanted to model uncertainty in perhaps a new way, involving a sort of real options approach. So the final report, published in August 2018, had these 5 parts, which I'm not going to dwell on because I want to get on to telling you about our main findings. And to do this, I'm going to show you a little video. It's very short, so...
New Zealand is committed to actively reducing its greenhouse gas emissions along with the rest of the world. The government asked the Productivity Commission to conduct an inquiry into how New Zealand can transition to a low emissions economy. We found that substantial change is required and that a foundation of stable and credible climate policy and institutions will be fundamental to the transition. The Commission recommends that the government should focus on 4 key areas that will work together in order to create this foundation. 1. Reforming and increasing the coverage of the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme. 2. Setting new climate laws with emissions reduction targets and budgets, and establishing an independent climate change commission to drive progress. 3. Establishing complementary regulations and policies, such as supporting the uptake of electric vehicles and including methane in an emissions pricing scheme. And 4. Substantially improving low emissions investment and innovation. Getting this foundation right will help to encourage 2 critical changes that are needed for the transition. First, to replace fossil fuels with clean electricity and other low emissions fuels across the economy, particularly in transport, but also in industry. Second, to change the way land is used. This includes encouraging more forestry to offset emissions in other parts of the economy, and changing the structure and methods of agricultural production. Emissions prices will be a critical motivator of change. The Commission finds that prices will need to rise considerably to generate action. Future innovation and technology will help determine the level of emissions prices. The Commission's report on how New Zealand can transition to a low emissions economy has been presented to Parliament. It's now up to the government to decide what action they take. Acting now is vital to address climate change. The decisions we make in the present are critical to our future. Read our report on how New Zealand can transition to a low emissions economy today at productivity.govt.nz/low emissions.
Oh, what's that? I don't know what that is. There we go. Well, our little video's already given some clues as to the insights we got from the modelling. Stable and credible climate policy and institutions, absolutely fundamental. One needs that certainty and that stability across political cycles to induce the private sector to invest and to have the confidence to invest. Pleased to say that, as has been mentioned, we now have a Zero Carbon Act that's been passed in Parliament and a Climate Change Commission set up. So 4 key policy and institutional pillars. Reform the emissions trading scheme, make it have realistic prices, and widen its coverage to all sectors of the economy. It's already a pretty broad scheme, but in particular agriculture is not in the scheme. Legislation institutions mentioned, innovation absolutely critical as well. I mean, predominantly New Zealand is a technology taker, but there's always the challenge of adapting imported innovations to suit the New Zealand context. And in areas like agriculture, we think that New Zealand is on the frontier of research there and has got a contribution to make. So those are the 4 pillars in some more detail, but in the interest of time, I'll move on from those. The emissions pricing, I think most of you know that there is another piece of legislation that's in Parliament at the moment that is going to reform the emissions trading scheme, bring in auctioning of New Zealand units, and already is on the basis of that, the emissions price for a tonne of CO2 equivalent is risen from about $25 to $35. So things are happening. So let's get on to the modelling. We felt this was an important part of the inquiry in order to get insights. So we assembled, actually co-funded by the Ministry for the Environment in New Zealand, we assembled what we felt was what we think is a very strong modelling team consisting of Vivid Economics, a London-based consultancy which is very experienced in this area, and 2 local modelling teams, that's Concept Consulting, who got a model for the energy sector and the transport sector, and Mutu Economic and Public Policy, who are a research group based in Wellington, very high quality economists who have specialised in land use and emissions. So we put together, or the modellers put together a couple of various components. The challenge was to get New Zealand's emissions down to, we had 2 targets. The 25 megatons by 2050 was that roughly 60% reduction from 2005, and then there was the new target of net zero by 2050. So we started off in 2018 up here around 70 megatons, and you look at the profile of New Zealand's emissions. There's nearly 50% there, just under 50% coming from agriculture, not much from electricity because it's already pretty clean, 80 to 85%. And quite a big chunk from transport, and you've got carbon sequestration, quite a chunk there from forestry. So we set the model to say, how do we get from there down to the 2050 targets? So I don't need to tell you this. We did the modelling. Why do you model? We want to handle a complex system, understand it, get insights from it. We wanted to test whether the targets were feasible, how could we achieve them at least cost, what alternative pathways might pop out depending on how technology evolves, and what some of the sizes of the key variables like emissions prices, and what sort of opportunities, choices and risks may lie down the track. So to do the modelling, we set it up so that technology is going to play a major part in any low emissions transition. So we brought that in by posing three broad scenarios for technology. So the first is what we call the policy-driven scenario. So under this one, we assume technological change is actually quite slow. So to drive the transition, you need high emissions prices, so that people are incentivized by the price to change their behavior, do emissions, low emissions things and fewer high emissions things. The second scenario we call disruptive decarbonisation. So we assumed that there would be rapid technological change that would disrupt current economic structures. So EVs are an example of that. The whole fossil fuel transport system will be disrupted by EVs. And the other one we talked about quite a lot was we talked about it as a threat in New Zealand of synthetic protein. So that traditional agriculture is disrupted by the food being made in factories, the protein being made in factories, cellular biology, and being able to food produced with a much lower carbon footprint. And the third scenario, broad scenario, stabilising decarbonisation. So this is where, again, technology comes to the rescue, but its type is that it enables the economy to preserve existing industries by reducing their emissions. And the two examples pictured there are a vaccine for cows to reduce their methane. The estimates are that if it's successful, it could reduce emissions by 20%, and carbon capture and storage. So with two targets and three broad scenarios, that gave us 6 pathways that we explored using the modelling. So the scenarios and the targets, that gives the 6 pathways. I'm not sure whether you've spotted the typo in 3 and 4. I only spotted it when I was looking over my slides at lunchtime. It says destructive decarbonisation, meant to be disruptive decarbonisation. Maybe it will be, yes. So now I'll go through the main insights. I think about 5 insights from the modelling. Insight 1 was that both targets look feasible to achieve. So these little charts here have got the sectors in colour and the emissions level in megatons on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis, and each, so PD25 is the policy-driven scenario targeting 25 megatons by 2050, and below it is the one targeting net zero. One thing you'll notice, which I'll come back to, is that to to get to net zero, below the line you see there's forestry coming in and sucking up a lot of CO2 out of the air, and just see how big a role that plays in this modelling. What prices came out of this? Well, I suppose you'd have to say we were pleasantly surprised. In getting to 25 megatons, we estimated that prices would have to rise from between $75 to $150 per tonne. That's New Zealand dollars. So a New Zealand dollar at the moment is worth about 65 US cents. I think at that time it might have been 75 US cents. Of course, the prices have to rise more for the zero target, and indeed they have to rise between about 150 and 250 by 2050. This, again, a little bit of a surprise, because New Zealand was regarded as a country generally that it would be hard to decarbonise because of agriculture. Half of our emissions coming from agriculture, and no clear or obvious technological solutions to reducing methane emissions from agriculture, and the fact that our electricity industry, electricity generation is already 80 to 85% renewables. But when we plug these numbers in against some estimates of what prices would be required in other OECD or developed economies that would be consistent with the Paris goal, you can see that most of the prices, the trajectories that we came up with, fall within the range for other countries. And in fact, there's one down here, the destabilising decarbonisation for the less stringent target, which comes in below it. So what's doing the work in the transformation? Well, the number one is this guy.